Today, we continue with Numbers chapters 17 through 20. I will read key passages and I encourage you to read the full chapters on your own. The full reading reference is provided for you below. After the rebellion of Korah in number 16, God takes decisive action. The question was no longer whether Israel would obey. The question was whether they would finally recognize whom God had chosen. God was not confused about leadership. The people were. And so God settles the matter once and for all. Number 17, Aaron's staff buds. 17, 1 to 5. God commands Moses to collect 12 staffs, one from each ancestral tribe. Each tribal leader's name was written on his staff. Aaron's name was written on the staff representing the tribe of Levi. Then God declares that the staff belonging to his chosen priest would sprout. Think about that. A dead piece of wood would suddenly show life. The miracle would not come from Aaron, it would come from God. The priesthood was not a position to be seized. It was a calling that God alone would give. 17, 6 to 11. Moses obeys as he instructed. The next day, he enters the tabernacle. Aaron's staff not only sprouted, it had produced buds. It had blossomed and it produced almonds. Life appeared where there should not have been. Later, Hebrews 9 and 4 tells us Aaron's budding staff was preserved as a testimony, a permanent reminder that God had chosen his priest. 17, 12 to 13. The people finally understood after witnessing judgment, rebellion, and now this miracle, fear has fallen upon them. They cry out, "We will die. We are lost. We are lost." For the first time in a long time, they understand something they had forgotten. God is holy. Sinful people cannot casually approach a holy God. The fear of the Lord had returned. Numbers 18, the responsibility of priesthood. Numbers 18 follows naturally from the previous chapter. If God has chosen Aaron's family, what responsibilities come with that calling? 18 and 1. God tells Aaron that he and his family bear the responsibilities for offenses connected to the sanctuary and priesthood. This was not a privilege without accountability. It was a sacred responsibility. The closer someone served to God's presence, the greater their accountability became. 18, 2 to 7. The Levites are assigned to assist the priests. Each group had its role. Others protected the holiness of worship. Then 18, 8 to 20. God provides for the priests through the offerings of the people. Unlike the other tribes, the priests would receive no territorial inheritance. The Lord himself would be their inheritance. God would sustain them through the worship of his people. This principle continues into the New Testament, where Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 9, 13 to 14, "Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple?" Then he adds, "In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel." The principle is clear. Those devoted to spiritual ministry may be supported through that ministry. 18, 21 to 32. The Levites themselves were required to tithe from what they received. Even those who ministered were called to honor God with what he provided. Now, the red heifer, 19. It is one of the most unusual chapters in the law. The entire chapter deals with death and purification. Why? Because death is the great reminder that sin has entered God's creation. In Numbers 19, 1 to 2, God commands the sacrifice of a red heifer. This ceremony was unlike other sacrifices. The animal was taken outside the camp. It was not offered on the altar. 19, 3 to 8, the heifer was slaughtered and burned completely. Cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet yarn were added to the fire. Every detail carried symbolic meaning. Everything associated with this ritual emphasized cleansing from the defilement of death. Death represented the consequences of sin. Death could not remain in God's presence. Even the priest conducting the ceremony became ceremonially unclean afterward. That alone shows how unique this sacrifice was. 19:9 to 22, the ashes were preserved and mixed with water for purification. Anyone who came into contact with a dead body became ceremonially unclean. God was continually teaching Israel sin brings death, death brings separation, and cleansing is necessary before approaching a holy God. This points forward to Jesus, who was also taken outside the city to suffer for sin on the cross. Numbers 20, the end of a generation. Numbers 20 opens quietly, but decades have passed. 20 and 1, Israel arrives in the wilderness of Zin during the first month of the 14th year. The judgment pronounced in Numbers 14 has now run its course. An entire generation has died in the wilderness. The consequences of unbelief have been fulfilled. Another crisis emerges, however, where there is no water. 22 and 13, the people once again complain. God instructs Moses to speak to the rock. Instead, Moses becomes angry. He rebukes the people, then he strikes the rock twice. Water comes out. The people receive what they need, but Moses disobeyed. The issue was not merely striking the rock, it was failing to honor God exactly as God commanded. As a result, God tells Moses and Aaron that neither will lead the people into the promised land. Even great leaders are accountable before God. 20:14 to 17, Moses appeals to the king of Edom for passage. Notice how he identifies Israel, your brother Israel. The Edomites descended from Esau, the Israelites descended from Jacob. The two nations shared common ancestry through Abraham and Isaac, yet Edom refuses passage. Family history, y'all, does not always produce peace. 22 to 29, Aaron's life comes to an end. God reminds Moses that Aaron will die because of what happened at Meribah. Aaron's priestly garments are transferred to his son Eleazar. Then Aaron dies on Mount Hor. For 30 days, everybody mourns. One of the greatest leaders of Exodus generation is gone. The wilderness generation is ending. A new generation is preparing to enter the land. Now, what do these chapters show us? God alone points spiritual leadership. Holiness produces healthy fear of the Lord. Greater responsibility brings greater accountabilities. 18 and 1. The Lord himself is the inheritance of his servants. 18 and 20. Death continually reminds humanity of sin's consequences. Even faithful leaders must obey God's commands completely. God's purposes continue even as generations pass away. 20 and 28. Now let's connect all of this across scripture. Aaron's budding staff connects to Hebrews 9 and 4. The priesthood points forward to Jesus Christ, our eternal high priest in Hebrews 4:14 to 16. Now, the red heifer points forward to Christ's suffering outside the camp in Hebrews 13:11 to 12. The water from the rock, 1 Corinthians 10 and 4, where Paul says the rock pointed to Christ. Moses being barred from entering the land reminds us that even the greatest human leaders cannot save. Only God can bring his people fully into inheritance. Now, I am encouraging you to read chapters 17 through 20 in full. Y'all watch how God confirms his chosen priest. Watch how he teaches his people about holiness. Watch how an entire generation passes away because of unbelief. And remember, the wilderness was never merely about reaching the promised land. It was about learning who God is. The story continues tomorrow.